She won the war. She always wins the war. That's the thing about Serafina Vale. The woman doesn't know how to lose, doesn't know how to stop, doesn't know how to exist without carrying something heavy on her back. 23 nobles tried to break her. 3 assassination attempts. 1 famine she personally negotiated Eldoria out of by trading 5 years of her own sleep. The kingdom breathes today because she chose suffocation. So when the doors swung open on the night of the Grand Peace Accord, and she saw her sister standing in her king's arms, the real question was never whether Serafina would survive it. The question was what kind of woman would crawl out the other side. Fatima? The ink was still wet. That was the detail that would haunt her longest. Not the candlelight, not the smell of wine and crushed flowers drifting from the king's private solar, not even the sound of her sister's soft laughter threading through a door that should have been locked. It was the ink on her own fingers. The peace treaty she'd spent 4 months hammering out between Eldoria and the Vale territories had been signed less than 2 hours ago, the parchment still cooling in the archive room 1 floor below, and the ink from 18 noble signatures had transferred to her hands when she pressed the seals herself, because Lord Harwick's wrist had trembled too badly to manage it alone. She stood in the corridor outside the king's solar and looked down at her right hand. Black smudges across 3 fingers, the color of victory, she'd told herself when she pressed that final seal. The color of everything you traded for this moment. Then she heard Evelyn laugh again. That particular laugh, the unguarded one, the laugh her younger sister only produced when she felt completely safe. And something in Serafina's chest went very, very quiet. Not broken. Not yet. Just quiet. The way a battlefield goes quiet in the 10 seconds after the last sword falls, before anyone understands who survived. She didn't push the door open dramatically. She didn't need to. The latch hadn't caught properly. The wood old, the fitting worn loose from 100 seasons. And her knuckles barely grazed the surface before it drifted inward on its own, as though the room itself had decided she deserved to see. Alaric stood at the window with his back to her, one hand resting at Evelyn's waist, his dark head bent toward her sister's pale hair. Evelyn sat on the edge of the writing desk, Serafina's own writing desk, the one she'd moved into the solar 3 years ago when she began managing the Crown's correspondence. With her feet dangling like a child's, her expression soft and private and entirely unaware. A goblet of wine sat untouched beside her hip. Neither of them spoke. They were doing that thing that couples do when words become unnecessary, when proximity becomes its own language, and Serafina recognized it immediately and with absolute precision because she had never in her life been permitted to experience it herself. She stood in the doorway for 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when your entire understanding of your life is rearranging itself. Serafina. Alaric's voice came first. He'd caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window, she realized. He'd been watching her watch him, and the particular note in her name when he said it told her everything she needed to know about how long this had been happening. Not alarm, not guilt exactly. Something worse. The measured tone of a man who had already rehearsed this conversation in his head and was now simply waiting for it to begin on its own schedule. Evelyn spun around and the goblet tipped, wine bleeding across the writing desk and a dark red stain that spread over the treaty correspondence stacked there. The correspondence Serafina had drafted herself. Every letter, every careful diplomatic softening of language designed to protect Eldoria from consequences. And for one surreal moment, all 3 of them watched the wine soak through the parchment, and none of them moved to stop it. Then Evelyn said, "Sarah?" And her voice broke on the second syllable, and Serafina thought, she knew I'd come tonight. She knew exactly when the signing would finish. She knew, and she didn't leave. "Close the door," Serafina said. Her own voice surprised her, flat, controlled. The voice she used when she was addressing the War Council about casualty projections. The voice that her generals had privately nicknamed the Stone, not cruelly, but with the specific reverence soldiers develop for tools that never fail under pressure. Alaric turned fully from the window. He was dressed informally, no crown, his collar open. Comfortable in a way she had not seen him comfortable in years, and she filed that detail away with the same cold mechanical efficiency she applied to military intelligence reports. He is comfortable. He is at ease. This room, in this configuration, is his idea of peace. I was going to tell you, he said. When? The word landed in the room like a stone into still water, and she watched the ripples move across both their faces, Evelyn's cheeks going white, Alaric's jaw tightening with something that was not quite remorse and not quite defensiveness, but occupied the uneasy territory between them. After the accord was finalized, he said, I didn't want to disrupt after the accord. She repeated it the way she repeated disputed numbers in budget meetings, holding them up to the light until the falseness became visible to everyone present. The accord I spent 4 months securing. The accord signed 2 hours ago, which you attended for 40 minutes before excusing yourself on account of a headache. She looked at Evelyn. You left the celebration early too. Stomach complaint. I believe your lady-in-waiting told me. Evelyn's hands were pressed flat against the edge of the desk. Her knuckles were white. She had always been the beautiful one. That was simply a fact, uncontested, unresented, a feature of the landscape Serafina had grown up inside, with their mother's coloring and their father's gentleness, and an entire emotional range that the world seemed to respond to the way flowers respond to morning light. Men had always loved Evelyn easily, instinctively, the way they loved things that didn't frighten them. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. Sarah, I need you to understand this wasn't... We didn't plan... Don't. The word came out sharper than she intended, and she watched her sister flinch, and she felt nothing in particular about causing that flinch except a distant clinical recognition that she had done it. Don't tell me what this was or wasn't. I don't need your accounting of it. She looked at Alaric. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, and that bothered her more than any of the rest of it, because she had spent 9 years reading Alaric Vane's face the way a navigator reads tide charts, because her ability to anticipate him had been the invisible infrastructure of everything she'd built, and in this moment he looked at her with something she had genuinely never seen directed at her from his direction before. Pity, not guilt. Not the complicated shame of a man caught in something he knows is wrong. Pity. The particular softness of someone looking at a person they no longer consider a threat. That was the moment something in her chest moved from quiet into cold. How long? She said. Serafina. How long, Alaric? He held her gaze. She respected him slightly for that. Most men looked away. 14 months. 14 months. She ran the arithmetic automatically, the way her mind always ran arithmetic when facts needed to be placed in context and sequence. 14 months ago, she had been managing the early stages of the Vale territorial dispute. She had worked, on average, 16 hours each day for the first 6 months of that negotiation. She had eaten most meals standing over dispatch tables. She had slept 4 hours a night, sometimes 3. She had sent 17 personal letters to Vale nobles, each one precisely calibrated to its recipient's vanities and fears, and she had revised each letter an average of 4 times before sealing it. 14 months ago, while she was doing all of that, Alaric had been falling in love with her sister. Right, she said. She turned and walked out. The corridor was empty. She'd dismissed her personal guard for the evening as a courtesy to the celebration, wanting the palace staff to enjoy themselves without the formal weight of her protection detail, moving through the party like a reminder that safety was always conditional. A decision she recognized now with a kind of dark amusement as perfectly characteristic. She had once again made a choice designed to give other people comfort at direct cost to herself. She walked to the end of the east corridor, pushed through the servants' passage, and climbed the back staircase to the old observatory tower that had been locked since the previous royal astronomer's retirement 7 years ago. She had kept a copy of the key. She had kept a copy of every key in the palace. Not out of paranoia exactly, but out of the same low-grade preparedness that had defined her entire existence. The bone-deep understanding that there would always come a moment when you needed a door that other people believed was closed. The observatory was cold and dusty, and the circular windows had gone gray with accumulated grime, but the view through the central aperture was still unobstructed. The city of Eldoria spread below in its nighttime configuration, lights and windows, the distant sound of celebration music from the public squares, where the peace accord announcement had apparently reached the common quarters. She could hear it faintly. Horns, singing, the particular quality of collective relief, the sound a population makes when it learns that the dying has stopped. She sat down on the floor with her back against the stone wall and looked at the ink on her hand. She had not cried yet. She noted this with the same impersonal attention she brought to all observable data points. She would probably cry eventually. She was not a person who had excised the capacity, only one who had learned to store it at a considerable distance from the operational center. But not yet. Not here. Not while she was still in the process of understanding the full geometry of what she had just walked into. 14 months. She pressed her ink-stained fingers against the cold stone floor and made herself think it through completely, because half-examined pain had always seemed to her more dangerous than the fully acknowledged kind. Her father had taught her that, one of the few genuinely useful things he'd taught her before the illness took him. Name the wound, girl. A wound you can't name owns you. A wound you can name, you can work around, so name it. The king had fallen in love with her sister. The king intended, she was certain, had likely planned with whatever passed for careful in Alaric's particular brand of emotional reasoning, to dissolve their political partnership and install Evelyn as his queen. 14 months of construction. The relationship, the intention, the plan. During which time Serafina had negotiated a territorial peace that would define Eldoria's next generation, managed 3 border incidents, suppressed a grain merchant conspiracy in the northern provinces, and personally redesigned the kingdom's tax assessment structure to prevent the collapse of the Western Territory's farming economy. She had done all of that, and simultaneously, she had been in the process of being replaced. There was something almost elegant about the geometry of it, if you could manage enough distance to appreciate geometry. She had always been most useful in crisis. That was simply the shape of her competence, the groove her particular intelligence ran in, and Alaric had, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not, allowed crisis after crisis to materialize and then allowed her to solve it, because a useful tool is difficult to put down even when you've already decided you no longer want it in your house. She was thinking about this, working through the cold mechanical architecture of it, when the door to the observatory opened. She didn't reach for a weapon. The habit of self-defense had never fully colonized her body the way it had some of her generals, but she came to her feet in a single motion that was less physical preparation than the simple refusal to be found sitting on the floor by whoever had come to find her. It was Eveline. Her sister stood in the doorway with a candle in one hand and her evening gown still on, her pale hair coming loose from its arrangement, her face showing the specific wreckage of someone who has been crying and has not yet decided whether to keep going or stop. She had always cried beautifully. That was also simply a fact, not a cruelty, just a feature of the difference between them. Evelyn's grief was visible and legible and invited response, while Serafina's had always been the kind that made people uncomfortable, too controlled, too contained, like watching someone hold a wound closed with their bare hands and refuse to ask for help.
"I knew you'd come here,"
Eveline said. Her voice was thick. "You always came here when things were bad. When Father died, you were up here for 2 hours before anyone found you. I remember. I followed you because—" She stopped, started again. "I need you to hear me, not as a queen or a strategist or whatever you've been being for the last 20 minutes. I need you to hear me as my sister." Serafina said nothing, which she recognized as a form of permission. Eveline came fully into the room and set the candle on the old observation table and turned to face her. In the candlelight, she looked very young. She was 6 years younger, 31, to Serafina's 37, but she had always occupied a different relationship with age than Serafina had, as though the years had worked differently on her, adding softness rather than weight. "I never wanted this," Eveline said. "I need you to know that. When Alaric when he started, I told him no. I told him repeatedly no. I told him it was impossible and wrong and that you were his partner in every way that mattered and that I wouldn't—" Her voice cracked. "He's persistent. You know how he is when he decides something. He doesn't hear no as a final answer. I know how he is. I should have come to you. I know that now. I knew it then too, if I'm honest, and I didn't come to you because—" She stopped, and the honesty in her face was painful to witness. The particular honesty of someone forcing themselves to say something that will not reflect well on them. "Because part of me was afraid of what you would do. Not to me, to him, to the situation. I was afraid you would handle it, and in handling it, you would become more of what you already are, and I would watch you sacrifice something else for the sake of—" "Eveline." "What?" Stop explaining your care for me. I don't need that right now. Her sister closed her eyes, opened them. He's going to announce it at the coronation ceremony next month, she said. He told me tonight that the timing felt right. The peace accord done, the kingdom stable, a new era beginning. He said he wants a queen who can stand beside him in the life he actually wants to live, not the one the kingdom forces on him. She paused. He said that. About you. That you were the queen the kingdom needed, not the queen he wanted. The silence in the observatory was very complete. Somewhere below, the celebration music continued. He's going to remove you from the Queen's Council, Eveline said quietly. He has letters drafted. Noble support has been. He's spent months building it. The lords who were frustrated with your policies, the ones who always thought you were too aggressive in the trade negotiations, the ones who felt you exceeded your authority in the northern suppression. He's been cultivating them. Sarah, he has enough signatures to formalize the transition without requiring your consent. I know, Serafina said. Eveline stared at her. You knew? I didn't know about you. I knew something was shifting in the noble alignment. I noticed it in February. Lord Drovan stopped attending my briefings in person and started sending his secretary, which he'd never done before. By March, I'd identified 7 lords who were coordinating with each other outside the standard council channels. She looked at the ink on her hand again. I assumed it was a challenge to the treaty negotiation strategy. I thought they were positioning to undermine the accord before it could be finalized. She paused. I was solving the wrong problem. Eveline looked at her for a long moment. You're not crying. No. Sarah, I know what he's been doing. You're allowed to fall apart about this. Something that might have been a smile crossed Serafina's face, quick and humorless and gone. Yes, she said. I'm aware. She pushed off from the wall and moved to the observation aperture, looking down at the city. The celebration was still ongoing, the public squares bright, the sound of it carrying up on the night air like proof of something. Tell me the rest, she said. The parts you haven't said yet. A pause from behind her. He has a timetable, Eveline said finally. The coronation is 32 days away. He wants to use it as the announcement. Present it as a new beginning. Eldoria at peace. The king taking a new queen to lead into a new era. He's been telling the sympathetic lords that you've become too consumed by the mechanics of governance, that you've lost sight of the human dimension of rule. Her voice had gone flat and miserable. His words, Sarah, not mine. I know whose words they are. She watched a cluster of lights moving through the lower quarter. Revelers, torches, the particular choreography of public joy. What does he intend for me? A title. An estate in the eastern provinces. An official acknowledgement of your service to the crown. Eveline's voice broke slightly on the last word. He called it an honorable retirement. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He's going to get us all killed. What? The noble alignment he's been building to support this transition, Drovan, Hartwell, the Marin brothers. I'm assuming Countess Voss given the pattern of absences. Those are not men and women who support anything out of sentiment. They have been patient, methodical, coordinated. They didn't spend 14 months building a coalition because they want Alaric to be happy with his wife. She turned from the window. They've been waiting for him to remove me. And the moment I'm gone, the moment there's no one between them and a king who has just demonstrated that he will let personal desire override strategic judgment, she stopped herself. Not because she was wrong, because she was right. And being right about this particular thing meant that the cruelty of the situation had just acquired an additional dimension she hadn't had time yet to fully absorb. She couldn't leave. Not because she didn't want to. Not because she wasn't standing in an observatory tower holding a wound closed with her bare hands and desperately, viscerally wanting to simply put it down. But because the kingdom she had spent her entire adult life constructing was about to be dismantled from the inside, and she was the only person who understood the architecture well enough to prevent it, and it didn't matter in the slightest what it cost her personally, because it never had. It never had, and she had never once, in 37 years, been anything other than completely clear-eyed about that fact, and she had made her peace with it, or had believed she had, until tonight. "What are you going to do?" Eveline asked. "Go to sleep," Serafina said. "It's very late." Sarah, There's nothing to be done tonight that can't be done better after sleep and in daylight. She moved toward the door, paused beside her sister, and looked at her for a long moment. Eveline's face was still wrecked with guilt and love, and the particular helplessness of someone who understands they've caused damage they can't repair. Serafina reached out and touched her cheek once, briefly, with ink-stained fingers. "I'm not angry with you," she said. "Not tonight. Maybe later. But not tonight." She left her sister standing alone in the observatory with the candle and the sounds of celebration drifting up from far below. She slept 4 hours, not because she was at peace, but because she had learned through years of crisis management that a body deprived of sleep makes predictable errors, and predictable errors in situations that required precise thinking were unaffordable luxuries. She lay in the dark of her chamber and stared at the ceiling and organized the information she had into categories: confirmed, probable, unknown. And when the categories were as complete as they could be without daylight and further intelligence, she closed her eyes and instructed herself to sleep. And she did, because she had learned to treat her own body as another instrument of statecraft, neither indulged nor neglected, maintained in functional condition because the alternative was operational failure. She woke before dawn and sent for Cedric Voss. Lord Cedric Voss was, depending on how you chose to measure such things, either the most dangerous man in Eldoria or the most useful. He occupied that particular category of noble that made other nobles nervous. Deeply intelligent, visibly bored, possessed of both the moral flexibility and the social standing to operate in spaces where more principled men could not go. He was 39 years old, lean in the way of someone who had never been soft, with the kind of face that looked like it had been designed by someone who considered conventional handsomeness a redundancy. It was interesting rather than beautiful, sharp rather than warm, a face that made you aware you were being assessed even when you were theoretically the one doing the assessing. He was also, Serafina knew with absolute certainty, one of the 7 lords who had been meeting outside council channels since February. She had summoned him to the small strategy chamber adjacent to the war room, her territory, deliberately chosen, in the hour just before the palace fully woke. He arrived precisely on time, which told her he had been awake already, and he was dressed in riding clothes rather than court attire, which told her he had been prepared to move quickly in some direction and had not yet decided which. He sat down across from her without waiting to be invited, which she permitted because she had not summoned him to perform the rituals of hierarchy. "You're aware," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Of the peace accord?" "Yes, I attended the signing ceremony." "Don't." A pause. Then, "What specifically are you referring to, my lady?" "You know what I'm referring to, Cedric. You've known for 14 months. You've been very patient." She placed her hands flat on the table between them. The ink still faintly visible on her fingers, she hadn't bothered to scrub it off, had actually left it deliberately as a kind of personal notation. "I'm not here to punish you for it. I'm here to understand what you've actually agreed to, because I don't believe it's as simple as Alaric has told himself it is." Cedric studied her face. It was, she had always thought, his most genuinely interesting quality, that he actually looked at things before deciding what to do about them, a capacity that was rarer in people of power than it should have been. "You want me to tell you what the coalition intends," he said. "I want you to tell me what you personally intend. The coalition is a different question." "Why me specifically?" "Because your mother is Countess Voss, who controls the river passage between Eldoria's eastern territories and the Vale border. Because the treaty I just finalized will be functionally worthless if that passage is closed or taxed into obstruction. Because you are the only person in the coalition who I believe is intelligent enough to understand that what they've built will not produce what they've told themselves it will produce." She looked at him. "And because you left a guard post rotation report on my desk 4 months ago that contained an error you would not have made accidentally." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has been seen clearly and is in the process of deciding whether that's dangerous or useful. "You kept that report," he said. "I keep everything." The error was, it exposed a weakness in the North Tower rotation. Anyone reading carefully would have seen it. "Yes?" "Which would suggest," he said slowly, "that someone wanted the North Tower Watch to be aware that there was an interest in their rotation schedule." "Or," Serafina said, that someone wanted me specifically to know that there was a player in the current game who was choosing, quietly, to give me information while appearing to align against me. She paused. Was I wrong? Hey? Kedrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the Marin brothers aren't interested in supporting the king's domestic happiness. I want to be precise about this. Whatever Alaric has told himself about their motivations, he's told himself they support his right to personal sovereignty, that they've recognized the crown's authority to determine succession structure. That's a beautiful story. His voice was flat. The Marins want the Vale Treaty dissolved. They've had trade interests in the territorial dispute for 2 generations, and the peace accord eliminates the leverage they've been building. They need the treaty dismantled within the year, and dismantling it requires a governing structure that's either too destabilized to enforce it or actively inclined against it. He leaned back slightly. Removing you accomplishes both. The new queen, your sister. She has no political infrastructure, no relationship with the Vale lords, no understanding of the pressure points that kept the negotiation from collapsing. And a king who has just demonstrated to his entire court that he will prioritize personal desire over strategic counsel is not a king who will hold a difficult treaty together when the first pressure arrives. Which the Marins will provide, Serafina said, within months. They're thorough. He looked at her. I've been at those meetings, my lady. I've watched them build it. They're not political opportunists. They're architects. They have been engineering this specific collapse for longer than Alaric has been planning his very romantic intervention. The war room was very quiet. Outside, the palace was beginning to wake. She could hear it in the distant mechanical way she'd always been able to hear it. Footsteps and routines and the low hum of an institution resuming its daily operations. Why are you telling me this? She said. It wasn't entirely a question. Because I'm not interested in what the Marins are building, Kedrick said. And because I made a calculation 14 months ago that I've been living with since, and the calculation was wrong, not morally wrong, such I want to be clear that my objections are not primarily ethical in nature. Strategically, wrong. I believed the transition would be smoother than it's going to be. I believed Alaric was more politically capable than he's demonstrating himself to be. And I believed... He stopped. Say it. I believed you would leave. He met her eyes. When it became clear what was happening, I believed you would recognize that you were being positioned out of power, and that you would do what capable people in untenable situations generally do, which is extract themselves before the extraction is done to them. I was wrong about that. Yes, she said. You were. Which means the timeline I was operating on is incorrect. Which means the window the Marins have to work with is significantly smaller than they believe if you intend to stay and... He paused. What exactly do you intend to do? She looked at him for a moment. I intend to let Alaric proceed with his announcement, she said. I intend to appear publicly to accept the transition gracefully. I intend to give the Marin brothers and their coalition every reason to believe that the path is clear. Kedrick's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. And privately? Privately, she said, I am going to spend the next 32 days very quietly building a different architecture. She stood. I'm going to need the coalition's meeting records, not summaries, the actual records. I'm going to need the current positions of the Marin brothers' household guard deployments in the capital. And I'm going to need you to continue attending those meetings and appearing committed. You want me to stay in place as your intelligence source, he said. I want you to choose, she said, clearly and finally, because I am not a person who operates with ambiguous allies, and if you tell me you're committed and then you're not, I will end your political viability in this kingdom so completely that your grandchildren will still be feeling the effects. She said it without heat, without threat, with the same precise flatness she used for everything, and he understood, she could see that he understood, that it was not a performance. Kedrick looked at her for a long moment. My mother, he said, has wanted to retire from active management of the river passage for 3 years. She's been waiting for a governing structure she trusted enough to hand it to. He paused. She'll support you. The passage is yours, if the rest of it holds. I didn't ask for your mother's passage. I know. I'm offering it anyway. He stood. It's a better alliance if it's not transactional. You taught me that, actually. One of your council speeches 2 years ago. You said the most durable political structures are built on aligned interest, not mutual debt. A pause. I thought about it for a long time afterward. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. The coalition is meeting again, she said. When? 4 days. At Dravon City Estate. Be thorough. And Kaedric. She turned back. He was still standing by the table, watching her with that particular quality of attention she'd noticed about him from their first meeting years ago. The quality of someone who understood that watching carefully was itself a form of action. Tell me something true, she said. Not useful, just true. He was quiet for a moment. You're the only thing standing between this kingdom and about 6 different varieties of catastrophe, he said. And you've known that your entire life, and you've done it anyway. And I think most people, when they call you cold, mean they can't understand why a person would keep paying that price. He paused. That's the truest thing I have at the moment. She held his gaze for 1 second. 2. That'll do, she said, and walked out. The next 3 weeks moved in 2 registers simultaneously. In the public register, Seraphina Vale performed the most demanding role of her career, a woman gracefully accepting diminishment. She attended court functions and smiled at the correct moments. She deferred to Alaric in council meetings with a gentleness that confused the lords who had expected resistance and seemed to unsettle even Alaric himself, who had clearly prepared for a confrontation he was not going to receive. She spoke warmly to Evelyn when protocol required it, and kept her interactions brief when it didn't, not coldly, but with the specifically calibrated warmth of someone managing emotional complexity in real time and unwilling to perform more than she could sustain. She was, she recognized, very good at this particular performance, and that recognition carried its own flavor of darkness, the understanding of how thoroughly her life had prepared her to make suffering look like composure. In the private register she worked. Kaedric brought her the coalition meeting records, transcribed from memory because actual documentation was too dangerous. She accepted this limitation and worked with what she had, cross-referencing against her own observation logs going back 20 months. The Marin brothers' pattern emerged clearly over 3 days of analysis. They had been coordinating with 4 separate trading consortia in the Vale territories, the same territories whose lords she had just negotiated a peace treaty with, and the financial architecture of those relationships was built on the assumption that the treaty would be voided within 18 months. They had made commitments. They had extended credit lines against those commitments. If the treaty held, they faced ruin. They were not political architects, she realized. They were desperate men who had over-leveraged themselves and needed a specific political outcome to survive. And desperate men were simultaneously more dangerous and more manageable than the patient kind. More dangerous because they were willing to accept risks that calculated actors wouldn't. More manageable because their options were fewer than they believed. She sent 3 letters to the Vale territories, quietly, through channels unconnected to the royal courier system. 1 to Lord Fenwick, who had the most to gain from the treaty's stability. 1 to Lady Caswin, who controlled the eastern port contracts that Eldoria's merchant class depended on. 1 to old Governor Haas, who had been at every significant diplomatic table for 30 years, and who had told her, during a private conversation on the final night of negotiations, that she was the first Eldorian representative in his experience who had negotiated as though Vael's interests were real rather than obstacles. She did not ask for help. She asked for information, specifically the names of Eldorian-connected parties who had approached Vael interests in the past 18 months with proposals contingent on treaty dissolution. She phrased each letter with care, not as a queen making demands, but as an individual sharing a concern and requesting the perspective of people whose judgment she respected. She sent the letters and waited. And meanwhile, she kept attending court functions and deferring to Alaric in council meetings and watching the calendar move toward Coronation Day with the focused calm of a woman who had long since stopped confusing stillness with resignation. On the 16th day, responses arrived from the Vale territories. On the 17th day, she visited Countess Voss. On the 24th day, she had a conversation with Lord Dravon that lasted 11 minutes and left him visibly shaken in a way that he concealed with imperfect success from the 2 scribes present, and she noted his failure of concealment with a kind of clinical satisfaction because it meant she had correctly calculated the pressure point. Kaedric, attending the coalition meeting on day 25, reported that the Marin brothers appeared agitated and that Dravon had been uncharacteristically quiet. Lord Hartwell had asked, apparently with genuine uncertainty, whether the Queen, She was still the queen, technically, until the coronation, whether the queen knew something they didn't. What did they conclude? She asked. That you don't, Kadrick said. He paused. They underestimate you in the specific way that people always underestimate you. They see the composure and they call it acceptance. They see the silence and they call it retreat. Good, she said. Is it? He looked at her. They were in the strategy chamber again. It had become their unofficial headquarters over the past weeks, a choice she'd made deliberately. Her space, her comfort level, her terms. I want to ask you something. Ask? What you're building, the Veil contacts, the Countess, what you're doing with Dravan, I understand the shape of it. You're constructing a network that can operate without the official authority of the Crown's support, something that survives the coronation transition. He looked at her carefully. But the Marins aren't going to stop at political maneuvering. If they believe the treaty is threatened, if the pressure I'm watching build in those meetings reaches the point I think it's building toward, say it plainly. There are whispers of a harder play, he said. Not a political coup, a physical one. The coronation ceremony will have more armed lords present than any event in the last decade because every faction wants to demonstrate relevance at the moment of transition. He paused. I don't have names yet. I don't have specifics, but the Marin brothers have been having conversations in private rooms that I've been excluded from, and men who exclude their allies from conversations are men who are planning something their allies wouldn't sanction. The silence in the room was different from the silence she'd experienced in the observatory. Less internal, more tactical. How excluded, she said. Completely, since day 22. He met her eyes. They decided something, Serafina. I don't know what. But the shift in the room was... He stopped. I've been in rooms where men were deciding to go to war. There's a specific quality to the air. I've been smelling it for 3 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How many of your personal guard do you trust completely? Not politically, personally. 7. I need 4 of them, starting tomorrow. She stood. And I need you to get back into those private rooms. They won't... I know they won't let you back into the conversations. She looked at him. I didn't say get back into the conversations. I said get back into the rooms. There are more ways to listen than with an invitation. He looked at her for a moment. You've been planning for this possibility since the beginning, he said. It wasn't a question. I've been planning for every possibility since the beginning, she said. That's what I do. She moved to leave, then paused, and something that was not quite her usual self-control flickered briefly across her face. Something human and tired and real that she almost immediately covered again, but not quite fast enough. Get some sleep, Kadrick. We're running out of the kind of time that can be slept through. 7 days before the coronation, a sealed letter arrived from Vale Governor Haas. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a very long time, looking at the window, at the city outside, at the sky above the city which was the same sky it always had been, indifferent and clear. The letter contained 6 names. 3 of them she recognized from her own investigation. 3 she had not encountered before. And beside one of the unknown names, in the governor's careful diplomatic hand, was a notation that didn't make immediate sense until she checked it against the coronation guest registry and found the name there, listed without title, registered as an attending official representative from the Northern Merchant District. She checked the name a second time against a separate list she kept in her own cipher. The list of attendees who had been granted access to the palace's inner gates on Coronation Day for the purpose of ceremony logistics. The name appeared twice. She stood very still. Then she sent for Kadrick. He arrived in 11 minutes, which meant he had been close and moving quickly already, and when he came through the door, she saw on his face that he knew something was wrong and had been knowing it all morning and had been waiting for her to confirm it. The private rooms, she said. What did you find? He was silent for a moment that told her everything. The ceremony schedule has been modified, he said. The guard rotation during the crown presentation, the 7 minutes when the king traditionally stands unguarded as a symbol of sovereign trust, those 7 minutes have been... He stopped. Someone moved the loyal guard assignment, replaced them with names I didn't recognize. I found it this morning in the logistics record. 7 minutes. The most ceremonially protected tradition in Eldorian coronation history, the moment of sovereign trust, deliberately unguarded, a symbol so embedded in the kingdom's political mythology that challenging it would itself constitute a form of political statement. 7 minutes where the king would stand alone with his new queen while traitors in palace livery stood close enough to— "Evelyn," she said. The word came out without calculation, without strategy, without the careful, measured control that governed everything else. Just the name, raw and involuntary, the sound of the one thing she had not allowed herself to think clearly about for 32 days. Evelyn would be standing beside Alaric during those 7 minutes. Kedrick was watching her face. "Yes," he said quietly. She looked at the letter in her hand, at the 6 names, at the window, at the city beyond the window that did not know what was coming. 32 days, she said. I spent 32 days building something, quietly, carefully. Her voice was completely even, and they moved faster than I calculated. What do we do? She looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, the face she turned outward matched exactly what was happening inside. Not the stone, not the composed diplomatic mask, not the careful performance of a woman who had learned to make suffering look like strength. Just Serafina, 37 years old, standing in the strategy chamber she'd built herself, looking at a man she had chosen to trust with information that could destroy her, holding a letter that told her the game had changed in ways she had not fully prepared for. "We go in early," she said. "Tomorrow morning. All 4 of your men and mine." She paused. "And Kaedric, the names on this list, do any of them have family in the palace?" He looked at the letter. His face did something complicated when he reached the 4th name. "That one," he said, pointing without touching. "His brother is—" He stopped. "Where?" she said. "He was assigned," Kedrick said, his voice gone very careful, "to your personal protection detail, 6 weeks ago, standard rotation." The silence in the room stretched out and out. "Right," Serafina said. She crossed to the door and turned the lock. The old iron lock she'd had installed herself, which opened only from the inside. And then she turned back to the room, and there was something in her expression that had never been there before in any council meeting, any war table, any negotiation, in 37 years of performing competence in the service of a crown she had bled for. Fear, quick and real and acknowledged, and underneath it, burning through it, already consuming it. Something older, something colder, something that had been waiting, she understood now, for exactly this. Her hand went to her side. Not to a weapon she carried. She was unarmed, had come straight from a court function, had sent her guard away. Her fingers closed on nothing but her own sleeve, and she stood there in the locked strategy chamber with the letter and the 6 names and Kaedric's face and the sound of the city below. And she breathed in once, deeply, and she said, "Lock the outer door and don't open it for anyone until I tell you to. I need 20 minutes to think, and then I need to tell you something that cannot leave this room." He moved to the outer door, and in the corridor outside, just barely audible through the stone and the iron and the distance, the sound of footsteps. Coming this way. Unhurried, purposeful. The footsteps of someone who had not been told the door would be locked. The footsteps stopped outside. Not the hesitation of someone who had taken a wrong turn, not the pause of a servant checking a room assignment. A deliberate stop. The kind that meant the person on the other side already knew she was in there, already knew the door had been locked, and was deciding, in real time on the other side of iron and stone, what to do about that. Serafina did not move. Kaedric had his hand on the outer door bolt. He looked at her. She held up 2 fingers. "Wait," and tilted her head toward the sound, and for 3 full seconds the only things audible in the strategy chamber were their own breathing and the specific silence of a person standing very still on the other side of a door. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away. Unhurried, exactly as unhurried as they'd arrived. She breathed out through her nose. "That was Tom," she said. Her voice was low. "My personal guard, the one whose brother is on the list." Kaedric's jaw tightened. "He was just checking your location." "He was just checking my location," she agreed, "which means someone sent him to check it, which means someone knows I received the governor's letter this morning." She set the letter on the table and pressed her palm flat over it. An old habit, covering sensitive documents, ingrained from years of working in rooms with too many windows. The courier who brought it, who received him? I don't know. Find out, tonight. She looked at the door. and pull Tom from my rotation quietly. Illness. Don't make it visible. She paused. He's probably not the architect. He's probably just a man who owes someone something, but I cannot afford probably right now. Kedrick nodded once, the clipped acknowledgement of a man who has moved past the phase of asking questions and into the phase of executing directions. And she recognized the shift in him with something that might have been gratitude if she had the bandwidth for gratitude at the moment. She didn't. She pulled the letter back toward her and looked at the sixth name again, Veth Marin. Younger of the two brothers, 44 years old, third-generation merchant nobility, estate in the river valleys, whose profitability had been directly and catastrophically threatened by the terms of the peace accord. She had negotiated those terms knowing they would cost the Marins. She had done it anyway because the alternative, leaving Vial's eastern access points under Eldorian tariff pressure, would have collapsed the treaty within 3 years. And a treaty that collapsed in 3 years was worse than no treaty at all. She had made the calculation, and she had been right about the calculation, and now Veth Marin was, apparently, planning to repay her correctness with something considerably more permanent than political opposition. She thought about Evelyn standing in the ceremony hall in 7 days, wearing whatever dress had been chosen for the coronation. Smiling the smile she used for public occasions, the one slightly smaller than her real smile, the one that meant she was performing happiness rather than feeling it. Standing beside Alaric, who would be wearing the crown and the expression of a man who had mistaken personal desire for sovereign right, and neither of them would know that the 7 minutes of symbolic vulnerability at the ceremony's center had been converted, by men with financial desperation and no remaining good options, into something else entirely. She folded the letter, creased it hard, and pushed it into the inner lining of her sleeve. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and when I'm done, you're going to want to argue with me. Don't." Kedrick sat down across from her. He had the specific stillness of a man who had learned, sometime in the past 3 weeks, that she said what she meant and meant what she said, and that the most useful thing he could do with that information was listen before responding. "I'm going to let them believe the plan is working," she said. "All of it. The transition, the coronation, the 7 minutes. I am going to let it proceed exactly as they've arranged it, and I am going to appear to every observer to have accepted my own removal from power with the kind of dignity that makes people feel good about having removed you." "Serafina, I said don't." He closed his mouth. "If I move against them now, with what I have, 6 names and a location pattern and a guard rotation discrepancy, I expose the network before it's complete. I hand Alaric a political crisis he will manage badly, and I give the Marins exactly the chaotic environment they need to accelerate whatever the harder play is. The conspiracy doesn't end. It goes underground, and underground it becomes invisible, which is the one thing I cannot work against." She looked at him steadily. "I need them to believe they've won. I need them comfortable. Comfortable men make visible mistakes. You're talking about using the ceremony itself as the trap. I'm talking about knowing exactly where every piece is going to be on a specific day at a specific time, and building around that knowledge instead of against it." She paused. "I've spent 32 days appearing to retreat. What I've actually been doing is ensuring that when the confrontation comes, it comes on ground I chose." Kedrick was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't immediately name. Not admiration, not exactly, and not fear, but the complicated combination of both that occurs when someone fully processes the depth of a chess game they'd believed they understood. "Your sister," he said. "Evelyn will be standing there." "I know." "And the king." "I know." "You're willing to let it get that close?" She met his eyes. "I'm willing to let it get exactly close enough that there are no exits, for anyone." She paused. "Including me." The silence in the room had weight to it, the kind of weight that settles when a person has said something true that cannot be unsaid. "4 of your men," she said. "I need their full schedules for the next 7 days, and I need them positioned inside the ceremony hall, not as official guard, not in livery, as guests, merchants, minor nobility, whatever cover holds. I need them where I tell them to be at the moment I tell them to be there. And if the timing is wrong, if the Marins move before the ceremony, then we adapt." She stood. "But they won't. They've waited 14 months. They've spent money they don't have against an outcome they believe is guaranteed. Men who have waited that long and spent that much don't accelerate without a reason. She looked at him. Don't give them a reason. He stood as well, slower, with the weight of someone carrying new information that hadn't yet settled into its final shape. You said there was something you needed to tell me that couldn't leave this room. She had said that, yes. And she looked at him now and made the calculation she'd been running since she sent for him 11 minutes ago. The specific calculation about trust, about how much of it was warranted, about the difference between an ally who was useful and an ally who could be trusted with the thing that would make them a liability if they chose to become one. She had never been good at this calculation, not because she was naive. She was constitutionally incapable of naivety. It had been wrung out of her by decades of managing people who meant her harm and calling it governance. But because she had always operated on the principle that the cost of misplaced trust was less than the cost of operating entirely alone. She had been wrong about that principle more than once. She had paid for being wrong. She had paid and kept going because the alternative was to stop trusting anyone at all, and a queen who trusted no one ruled nothing except her own isolation. My contact in the Vale territories, she said. Governor Haas. The letter. Yes. He included a seventh name. She watched Kadrick's face. A name not on the coalition list, not connected to the Marins or Dravan or any of the group you've been monitoring. She paused. A name I recognized from a different context entirely. Whose name? She told him. Kedrick stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then he sat back down, heavily, as though his legs had made a decision his mind hadn't fully ratified yet. That's not possible, he said. It's in the governor's hand. He included a transaction record. 6 months ago, before the accord was finalized, before the coronation was announced, before any of this was visible. She looked at him. Someone purchased access to the palace's architectural records, specifically the ceremony hall's guard rotation historical patterns. Not the current rotation, the historical ones, going back 30 years. To identify the 7 minutes, Kadrick said quietly. To verify that the tradition had never been modified. To confirm that the symbolic vulnerability was real and consistent and could be relied upon. She let that settle. That's not Veth Marin's style. The Marins are financial operators. They work through leverage and debt and economic pressure. This is someone who thinks about architecture, about structure, about how institutions create predictable patterns that can be exploited. Kedrick was looking at the table. How long have you known about the 7th name? Since the letter arrived this morning. And you didn't... He stopped. I needed to see your face when I told you, she said. I needed to know whether the name surprised you. He looked up at her. Surprised me. Yes, she said. I know. And she had known. The moment she saw his legs give, that particular involuntary response, the body's honest commentary on information the mind hadn't chosen yet. Kadrick was capable of a great deal of controlled presentation. His knees were not. Which means your involvement in the coalition didn't include knowledge of this person. Which means the Marins themselves may not know who they're actually working with. Or they were told not to know, Kadrick said slowly, because the person didn't want to be visible to the coalition members in case one of them... He stopped, met her eyes. In case one of them was yours. There it is, she said. The understanding moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Someone had been watching the coalition the same way she had been watching it, from a distance, through selected intermediaries, careful not to be directly present in any room where they could be identified. Someone who wanted the conspiracy to succeed but did not want to be attached to it. Someone who would benefit from the outcome but needed clean hands when the accounting was done. They're not the architect, she said. The Marins. Dravan. The whole coalition. They're not the design. They're the instrument. She looked at the window, at the city, at the ordinary daylight falling on ordinary stone and the people moving through it who had no idea what was being built above their heads. Someone positioned them. Someone identified their desperation and their interests and gave them a direction and let them build something that would accomplish a goal they themselves could not afford to be seen pursuing. The question, Kedrick said carefully, is whether the goal is the coronation, or whether the coronation is just the opening. She looked at him. If the 7th name is who you're saying it is, he said, then the goal isn't a change in queens. The goal is a change in... Don't say it out loud, she said quietly. Not yet. Not in a room whose walls we haven't verified. He closed his mouth. She moved to the chamber's north wall, old stone, thick, original palace construction, and pressed her ear against it the way she had done as a girl, sneaking through the servants' passages, learning the building's acoustic geography before she ever had the official authority to command a single room inside it. Silence. The deep silence of stone that hadn't been disturbed. Tonight, she said, stepping back, I need you to do two things. The courier who delivered the letter, find him before anyone else does. And the seventh name. I need to know their location for every day between now and the coronation. Physical location, not official schedule. Where they actually are. Those are very different tasks in terms of risk. I know what they are. Kaedric stood again, and this time his legs held steady, and she noted that too. The speed with which he had re-established his equilibrium, the way the shock of the seventh name had moved through him and been integrated without shutting him down. She had chosen well, she thought, with the detached precision she brought to all assessments. The guard report 4 months ago had not been an accident. He had been watching her the same way she had been watching him, and they had arrived at this moment, locked in a strategy chamber with a conspiracy that was larger than either of them had calculated. Through a series of independent decisions that had, somehow, ended up pointed in the same direction. She didn't find that comforting. She found it useful, which was close enough. I'll send word through the west kitchen passage, he said. The rotation there hasn't been touched. Use the baker's boy, not a page. Understood. He moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the bolt. He didn't turn around. The letter. The governor's letter. You're carrying it. Yes. If Tom reported your location and someone sent him to do it, and if that someone has eyes on the palace passages, they'll look for the letter, she said. Yes. Give it to me, he said. I'll carry it out. They're not watching me, not yet. She reached into her sleeve and held the folded parchment out without comment. He took it without turning around, slipped it somewhere inside his riding coat, and unbolted the door. Serafina, he said, still not turning. What? The seventh name. Is it someone you could have predicted? Looking back, is it someone you should have seen? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. He nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible. Then he opened the door and walked out, and she listened to his footsteps until they faded. And then she stood alone in the locked strategy chamber and let herself have 30 seconds, exactly 30, she counted, of the thing she had been keeping at arm's length since the observatory tower, and the ink on her fingers, and the sound of her sister's private laugh. Not grief, not quite. Something harder and colder and more structural, like discovering that the foundation of a building you'd spent your life in had been quietly rotting for longer than you'd lived there, and you had known, on some level, in the way the body knows things before the mind will say them, and you had chosen not to look. She had spent 37 years being indispensable. She had made herself indispensable with the specific intent of making herself safe, because the lesson of her childhood, a kingdom that valued charm over competence, a father who was loved for his warmth while the treasury quietly collapsed, a mother who smiled beautifully at every function and died without having made a single decision that lasted, had been clear and early and completely absorbed. The only safety available to a person like her was usefulness. Make yourself necessary. Make the cost of losing you higher than the cost of keeping you. There was no sentiment reliable enough to build a life on, no relationship guaranteed enough to depend on, no love that hadn't demonstrated, somewhere in her experience, the specific capacity to evaporate when it became inconvenient. So she had built usefulness instead. She had built it deliberately and methodically, and with the complete commitment of a person who has decided that if you cannot have the thing you actually want, you will build the best possible version of the thing available. And someone, the seventh name, the invisible architect, had spent months studying that structure, had identified exactly how it worked, had looked at the thing she'd built and found the specific load-bearing point that, if removed, would bring it down cleanly. 30 seconds. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pressed her ink-stained fingers, faded now, 4 days old, barely visible, against the stone table and felt the cold of it move up through her palms. Then she unlocked the door, and walked out. There were 4 days left before the coronation when Eveline appeared at her chamber door at midnight. Not with a candle this time. With a bruise on her left wrist, partially covered by her sleeve, and the particular quality of stillness in her face that Serafina recognized as the expression their mother had worn in the days after their father raised his voice, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a person learning that a space they had believed was safe had revised its terms. She let her sister in without speaking and closed the door and stood in the center of the room and waited. "He's frightened," Eveline said. Her voice was even, but her right hand was wrapped around her own left wrist, thumb pressed against the bruise through the fabric. "Not of the conspiracy, of you. He knows something is wrong. In the court, in the noble alignment, he's been feeling it shift for days. And he's convinced himself you're the cause of it." "He's correct that something is shifting," Serafina said. "He's incorrect about the direction." "Sarah," Eveline's jaw tightened. "He grabbed my wrist because I told him he should speak to you, that working against you was... I told him that you were the only person who had ever..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He told me that my affection for you was a loyalty problem." Serafina looked at her sister's wrist, at the careful way Eveline held it, unconscious, protective, a gesture so automatic it had probably been happening for weeks without being consciously identified. "How long?" she said. "It's the first time he's..." "How long has he been frightened enough to stop being careful?" Eveline's eyes closed briefly. 10 days. Since the accord finalized, since the celebrations ended and the court returned to ordinary operation, and he started feeling... He said the room changed when he walked into it. He could feel the assessments happening. He said it felt like everyone was waiting for something. She opened her eyes. "He's not wrong about that either." "No," Serafina said. "He's not. What is happening? The real version, not..." She gestured slightly. "Not the version you're performing for the court." Serafina looked at her sister for a long moment, at the bruise, at the expression underneath the careful evenness, at the 31 years of a person she had protected and resented and loved with the specific frustration of someone who could not stop caring about a thing they had decided would be simpler to stop caring about. "There is a conspiracy," she said. "It existed before Alaric's plans for the coronation. It was accelerated by them because removing me created the conditions they needed. It is not primarily about the change in queens. That was always a vehicle, not a destination." She paused. 4 days from now, at the coronation ceremony, something is going to happen. I cannot tell you what specifically. What I can tell you is that you need to not be standing next to Alaric during the crown presentation." Eveline stared at her. "I'm arranging for a delay," Serafina said. "A small one. There will be a moment. I will send you a signal, a specific signal, before the ceremony reaches the crown presentation. When you receive it, you will develop a sudden and visible physical complaint. You will be escorted from the ceremony floor by your lady-in-waiting. You want me to fake an illness? I want you to not be in the direct physical vicinity of the king during a 7-minute window when armed men have been positioned to use his symbolic vulnerability as..." She stopped, selected different words. "I want you to be somewhere else. That's all." Eveline was very still. "He's in danger. Everyone in that room is in some configuration of danger. I'm managing the configurations." "Alaric," her voice had gone strange. "Even after..." "Eveline." She said her sister's name the way she'd said it in the observatory. Not cold, not warm, just level. The tone that meant we are past the point where the personal history is the relevant information. "I don't need you to have feelings about Alaric right now. I need you to be somewhere specific at a specific time. Can you do that?" A long pause. "Yes," Eveline said. "What's the signal?" "I'll send word the morning of." She looked at her sister's wrist again. "Is there anywhere in this palace you can be for the next 4 days that isn't Alaric's direct orbit?" "My own chambers. My ladies. Eveline paused. "I've been spending more time in the East Garden. He doesn't come there." "Stay there," Serafina said, "as much as protocol permits." Eveline moved toward the door and then stopped, her hand on the frame, not looking back. "He's going to lose everything," she said quietly. "Isn't he? Not just the plan, not just the coronation. Everything." "That depends," Serafina said, on choices he hasn't made yet. But you're not going to let him be. I'm going to do what I always do, Serafina said. What the kingdom requires. She paused. Go to sleep, Evie. 4 days. Her sister left. She stood alone in the chamber again, and this time she did not count to 30. She moved directly to the writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began writing in the cipher she'd developed 6 years ago during the border crisis, when she'd needed to communicate with forward commanders without the dispatches being readable by anyone who intercepted them. She wrote 3 letters. The first to Countess Voss, the second to Lord Fenwick in the Vale territories, the third to the 7th name directly. No pretense, no diplomatic softening, no careful calibration of language. 12 words, in plain text. No cipher necessary because the message itself was the signal. I know. I have everything. The only question is what happens next. She sealed all 3 with blank wax, no crest, no identifying mark, and set them in the specific location in the floor panel beneath the writing desk where the baker's boy would collect them in the morning. Then she sat in the dark and looked at the window and thought about architecture, the kind built in stone, the kind built in relationships, the kind built in the specific load-bearing decisions a person makes when they are young and afraid and have decided that usefulness is the only reliable foundation. The 7th name had studied her architecture, had found the load-bearing point, what they had not calculated, what no one in 37 years had calculated, because no one had ever been required to, because she had always found a way to make the weight bearable before it became critical, was what happened when the load-bearing point held anyway. Not because it was designed to, because she was still standing underneath it. Outside, the palace night moved through its routines. Guards rotated, torches burned. The city below was dark and quiet, and entirely unaware that in 4 days it was going to wake up into a kingdom that looked nothing like the one it had gone to sleep inside. And in 3 days, before the coronation, before the ceremony, before the 7 minutes and the conspiracy and the 7th name and all of it, the letter she had just written would reach its destination, and the person who had spent months building something designed to end her would open it and read 12 words and understand with complete and irrevocable clarity that the thing they had built was not a trap she had failed to see. It was a trap she had been walking them into. The only question, the one she had no answer for yet, the one that kept her awake in the dark with her ink-faded fingers pressed against the cool wood of the desk, was whether she had been right, whether the architecture would hold, whether, when the moment came, she would still be the person she had built herself to be, or whether the 7th name had seen something in her structure that she herself had not yet found. She would know in 4 days. There was a sound from the corridor, not footsteps this time, something smaller, a scratching at the base of the door, the signal the baker's boy used when he came early, when there was something that could not wait until morning. She crossed to the door and opened it. The boy thrust a folded note into her hand and was gone before she could speak. She unfolded it. 1 line. No signature. In handwriting she did not recognize. The letters will not reach them. We already have the boy. She looked up at the empty corridor, at the torchlight on stone, at the palace that she had spent 37 years learning room by room and passage by passage and lock by lock, and she understood, with the specific cold clarity of a woman who has just felt the floor shift beneath her feet, that she was no longer managing a conspiracy. She was inside one, and the door behind her was already closed. She read the note a second time, not because the words were unclear. 12 words on a folded scrap of parchment, no signature, no cipher, written in a hand she didn't recognize, which itself was information, because she recognized every significant hand in this palace, had made it her business to recognize them the same way she made it her business to know the lock on every door. An unrecognized hand meant either someone new or someone who had never needed to write to her before. Both possibilities had specific implications, and she was running both simultaneously as she stood in her open doorway looking at the empty corridor where the baker's boy had been 30 seconds ago and was no longer. The letters will not reach them. We already have the boy. She stepped back inside, closed the door, turned the lock. The letters. 3 of them. Countess Voss, Lord Fenwick, the 7th name. Written in cipher for the first 2, plain text for the 3rd, sealed with blank wax, placed in the floor panel beneath the writing desk. She crossed the room in 4 steps and lifted the panel. Empty. The letters were gone. She set the panel back down with the particular care of someone whose hands have a slight tremor they are actively refusing to acknowledge, and she stood in the center of her chamber and looked at the floor and made herself complete the picture. The boy had collected them, or someone using the boy's collection protocol had collected them. Someone who knew the location of the floor panel. Someone who knew the cipher flag, the timing, the specific procedural detail of how she moved sensitive correspondence out of the palace. The operational security she'd built over 9 years had just been walked through like a paper door. She thought about Kaedric, about the riding coat, about the governor's letter and the 7th name and the decision she'd made in the strategy chamber to hand him the one piece of evidence that tied everything together. She thought about his knees giving when she said the name, and she thought about whether knees giving could be performed, whether a man skilled enough to embed himself in a noble coalition for 14 months without being burned was skilled enough to manufacture a physical reaction on demand. She thought about the guard rotation report 4 months ago, the deliberate error, the implicit invitation. She thought about how perfectly it had worked. The thing about being taken apart by someone who studied you specifically is that the damage has a particular quality. It doesn't feel like an attack from outside. It feels like an internal failure, like discovering that the instrument you've relied on most completely was the one most precisely calibrated to produce exactly this moment. Every person she had ever trusted had been a calculation. Every calculation had included a margin for error. She had simply, catastrophically, calculated the wrong margin for the wrong person. She gave herself no more time than that to feel it. Not because she was above feeling it, but because she was 3 days from a coronation and the correspondence network was compromised, and somewhere in this palace there was a baker's boy who had either been bought or was currently in a situation she did not want to complete that thought about. And none of that could be addressed from inside a locked chamber with her back against the wall. She changed her clothes. Not the court dress. Riding clothes. Dark wool. Nothing that announced her. She strapped the small blade she kept in the chest beneath her winter linens to her left forearm, not because she expected to use it, but because the weight of it was a form of information. You are in a situation where the blade is necessary. She had learned to use the blade's weight as a diagnostic. When she stopped noticing it, she was calm. When she felt it with every step, she was correctly frightened. She felt it with every step. She went out through the servants' passage. Well, the West Kitchen passage was empty at this hour, which should have been reassuring and wasn't, because the West Kitchen passage was never fully empty. There were always night staff, bread setters, the low-level palace operations that ran through darkness so that the daylight functions could proceed on schedule. She moved through it with her shoulder brushing stone and her ears cataloging every sound, and the specific absence of the ordinary sounds was its own alarm, the silence of a space that had been recently cleared rather than naturally vacant. She was 3 corridors from the outer pantry access when she heard voices. Male. 2 of them, low, the particular register of men having a conversation they believe is private. She stopped at the corner and did not breathe. Moved to the East Wing holding room. The boy's fine, not harmed. She'll know by now. Yes. A pause. Then the second voice, slightly different register, slightly older. He said to let her run, said she'd go for Voss directly. And if she doesn't, she will. It's what she does when the network's cut. She goes back to the last reliable node and rebuilds from there. A sound of movement, cloth against stone. He's got people at the Countess's gate already. All of them? Enough. Serafina stood at the corner and the blade on her forearm weighed approximately 10,000 pounds. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, he mapped my contingency behaviors. He didn't just study my network. He studied how I respond when the network fails. The 7th name had not simply infiltrated her operation. They had modeled her, had built a predictive architecture of her decision-making under pressure, and positioned resources at every node she would logically retreat to when the primary structure was compromised. She was not walking into a trap. She had been inside the trap before she understood she was in one. She turned around and went back the way she'd come. Batad. She needed someone they hadn't modeled. The problem was that everyone she trusted with operational capacity had been introduced to that role through her own deliberate selection, which meant every person she might go to was a person the 7th name had likely mapped as a potential resource. The value of being completely self-sufficient for 37 years was also, she was understanding now, with the specific dark humor of someone who has just seen their greatest strength revealed as their greatest liability, the thing that made her entirely predictable. She had no peripheral relationships, no connections that existed outside the architecture of her usefulness. No one who knew her in a way that hadn't been filtered through the machinery of what she did, except one. She stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about what she was about to do. And then she thought about the note in her hand and the empty floor panel and the voices in the kitchen passage, and she stopped thinking and moved. The East Garden. Evelyn was not asleep. She was sitting in the small stone alcove at the garden's north end, with a candle that had burned most of the way down and a book open on her lap that she clearly hadn't been reading. And when Serafina came through the garden gate, she looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting for something bad to arrive and was simultaneously relieved and terrified that it finally had. "Tell me what happened," Evelyn said. "The network is compromised. My correspondence is intercepted. I have people positioned against me at every logical fallback point." She sat down beside her sister on the cold stone without ceremony. "I have approximately 3 hours before whoever is running this realizes I didn't go where they expected and starts looking for where I actually went." Evelyn was very still. "What do you need? I need to know if you trust your lady in waiting. Completely. Not diplomatically. In the way you trust something when there is no margin." "Marais." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Does she have family outside the palace? Someone with a horse and a reason to travel before dawn without attracting attention?" "Her brother runs the grain supply route to the North District. He leaves before first light every third day." Evelyn paused. "Today is the third day." Serafina reached into her boot and removed the small folded document she'd placed there 3 days ago as a contingency for a situation she'd hoped not to use. The contingency she hadn't told Kaedric about, hadn't told anyone about, because some architecture you build alone in the dark and show no one. Not because you distrust your allies, but because the moment you show it to someone, it stops being the thing you kept back. "I need this delivered to Lord Fenwick personally, not to his household, not to a secretary, his hands." She held it out. "Can Maret's brother do that? I'll wake her now." Quietly. And Evie, she caught her sister's wrist as she stood, not hard, just contact, the specific pressure of having something else to say that was difficult to say. "If this goes wrong, if the next 3 days produce an outcome I haven't controlled for, you need to be visible and public and loudly uninvolved in all of it. You understand what I mean by that?" Evelyn looked at her. "You're telling me to let you fall if you fall. I'm telling you that the kingdom survives what happens to me. It does not necessarily survive what happens to you if you're attached to the wrong version of events when the accounting happens." She let go of her wrist. "Go get Marais." Evelyn went. Serafina sat alone in the dark garden and listened to the city and thought about Kaedric, about the specific pleasure of being correctly read by someone, about the conversation in the strategy chamber where she had told him not to argue, and he hadn't argued, and how that particular quality of disciplined listening had felt, in the moment, like alignment, and how she understood now that disciplined listening is also a tool of intelligence gathering, that the best way to understand how someone thinks is to ask them to explain their thinking and then stay very quiet. She had explained everything. She had handed him the letter. She had trusted him with the 7th name and watched his knees give and called it honesty. The candle Evelyn had left behind guttered in a brief wind and nearly died and then held. She watched it stabilize and thought about the 37 years of usefulness she had built and whether any of it had produced anything except the precise set of vulnerabilities that were currently being used against her. And she stayed with that thought long enough to fully feel it, the specific weight of it, the kind of weight that doesn't break you in the moment but accumulates over time until one day you reach for the thing you built your life around, and it isn't there. Then she set it down and moved on, because the candle was still burning, and she still had 3 days, and the letter was on its way to Fenwick, and she was not in the positions they expected her to be in, which was the only advantage she had left, and she intended to use it with everything she had. Kaedric found her at dawn. Not through the network was burned. He found her because he knew the East Garden, and he knew Evelyn's habits, and he had, she surmised, worked through the same logical chain she'd worked through in reverse. If she wasn't at Voss's, she hadn't run, which meant she'd identified the positions at the fallback points, which meant she knew the network was mapped, which meant she was somewhere unpredictable. He came through the gate alone, no riding coat, dressed differently than the previous day. Deliberately so, she recognized, a small operational adjustment. I know you noticed the coat. And he stopped 8 feet from where she stood, and he did not pretend. How much do you know? He said. Everything that matters. Her voice was completely even. The question is whether you're going to make me say it. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled presentation, not the careful assessment, not the strategic watchfulness she'd cataloged over 3 weeks of working together. Something raw. Something that occupied the space between guilt and the specific frustration of a man who had made a calculation that had not produced the outcome he intended. The 7th name came to me 8 months ago, he said, before I left the guard rotation report, before any of the contact with you. His voice was flat, not defensive. Flat in the way of someone choosing precision over self-protection. They had leverage, a debt my family owed from my father's time, a debt I didn't know existed until it was presented to me with full documentation and a specific request attached. What was the request? To stay close to the Marin Coalition, to report on its development, to maintain proximity to the Queen's operations. He paused. And when the time came, to make sure the Queen's correspondence didn't reach its destinations. The garden was gray and still in the early light. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cart moved through the streets, the ordinary percussion of the city beginning its day. You didn't bring me in, she said. 8 months ago. You could have come to me with the leverage and the documentation and the request, and you chose not to. I chose not to because the leverage was real and the documentation was... He stopped. My younger brother. He's 17. The debt wasn't financial. She looked at him. He's alive, Kedrick said. He's been alive and will continue to be alive as long as I perform as instructed. That was the arrangement. His jaw was tight. I made a calculation. I told myself I could manage both, stay inside the arrangement long enough to understand its full scope, feed you enough genuine information to maintain your trust, and find a way to extract my brother before the critical moment arrived. He met her eyes. I was wrong about the timeline. You were wrong about the timeline, she said. And now I have 3 days, no network, compromised correspondence, and a conspiracy I don't fully understand the ceiling of, and the one person I was using as my primary intelligence source was reporting my movements to the architect the entire time. Yes. And your brother is being held at an estate I can't locate. She looked at him for a long time. The garden, the candle stub, the weight of the blade on her forearm, and the 3 days on the calendar, and the letter that was either on its way to Fenwick or already intercepted. And she stood in the middle of all of it and made the calculation she'd been avoiding since the kitchen passage voices, the one she had enough information to make now and had been refusing to make, because making it required accepting a version of her situation that was significantly worse than anything she'd planned for. Who is the 7th name, she said. Say it out loud. Serafina. Say it. A pause. Then, quietly, with the specific weight of a word that changes the shape of every room it's spoken in, Harwick. Lord Harwick, who had been at the peace accord signing, whose wrist had trembled, who she had steadied with her own hands, the ink from the treaty transfers pressing against his skin, and she had read it as age and emotion and the physical reality of a man who had lived long enough to witness something he'd believed impossible, and she had felt something close to warmth for him in that moment. The rare warmth she allowed herself when something she'd built was recognized. Lord Harwick, who had been the Crown's senior advisor for 22 years, who had mentored 3 generations of council members, who had sat across from her in more war rooms and budget sessions and crisis meetings than she could count, and who had been, throughout all of it, the closest thing she had to a political parent, the person who had taught her the architecture of power, who had shown her how institutions worked and how to work within them, who had told her once, in the 3rd year of her service, that she was the finest strategic mind he had encountered in 4 decades of governance, who had then, apparently, spent the next several years learning everything she'd learned from him and using it to build the trap she was currently standing in. She sat down on the cold stone bench. This was what complete betrayal felt like, she understood, not the sharp rupture of Alaric and Evelyn in the solar. That had been a wound, clean-edged, definable, a thing she could hold at arm's length and analyze. This was different. This went back further. This called into question not just the present structure, but the foundation beneath it. Every lesson, every decision, every carefully constructed piece of the architecture she'd built, and who had stood at her shoulder while she built it. He taught me how to hide correspondence routes, she said, mostly to herself. He taught me the cipher. Yes, Kedrick said quietly. I know. He taught me to read noble alignment patterns, the specific indicators, meeting frequency, proxy attendance, the guard report errors. She looked up. He gave me the methodology I used to identify the coalition. He gave you a methodology that had specific blind spots built in. Kedrick sat down across from her, not close, the careful distance of someone who understands they are not in a position to offer comfort, but hasn't entirely decided to stop trying. The blind spots pointed you at the Marins, at the obvious threat, not at him. The coalition was real, she said. The Marin conspiracy is real. Yes. And he built it. Not for the coronation, or not only for that. He needed the instability. He needed the conspiracy to be real and visible and large enough to occupy your full attention while the actual mechanism assembled itself somewhere you weren't looking. He paused. The Marins don't know who's been directing them. They believe they're acting on their own financial desperation. They are, but their desperation was managed. The credit overextension, the treaty terms that cornered them, the specific configuration of pressure that made violent action feel like the only remaining option, that was designed. She heard this and she sat with it, and she understood what it meant about the peace accord she had spent 4 months building. The accord Harwick had attended. The accord she had believed was her finest work. 4 months of precise negotiation, 17 letters, the sleepless nights, the strategic sacrifices. The version of herself she had pushed hardest against every limit to produce. Harwick had been at the table. He had not interfered with the negotiation. He had simply ensured that the specific treaty terms that emerged from it would produce, as a secondary effect, the financial conditions that would drive the Marins toward violence. He had let her build the accord. He had possibly even admired it, and he had used it as one more piece of the architecture. What does he want? She said. The actual goal. Kedrick was quiet. Kedrick? The crown, he said. Not for himself. He's 68 years old and he has no heirs and he has no personal ambition for the throne. That was always true. I believe that was always true. But he has a candidate. Someone he's been grooming for longer than any of this. Someone who will be positioned, after the coronation ceremony produces its chaos, as the stable and legitimate alternative to a failed king. He paused. I don't know who the candidate. That's the piece I couldn't get. She stood. Not from agitation. From the specific physical response of a person whose mind has reached a conclusion that requires the body to begin moving toward it. The coronation isn't just an assassination attempt, she said. It's a succession mechanism. Alaric dies, or is so completely discredited that he might as well. The legitimate council is in chaos, and someone walks into the vacuum with Harwick's endorsement and a prepared narrative. Yes, and I'm meant to be gone by then. Retired to the Eastern Estate, or, she stopped, ran it forward. Or implicated. If my correspondence was intercepted and redirected, if the letters I wrote were delivered to the wrong people with the wrong framing, she felt the floor shift again, the second time in 12 hours, the particular nauseating sensation of understanding that the thing you thought you were doing was being done to you. He can position me as the architect, the queen who tried to stop the transition by conspiring with foreign lords against the crown. The evidence trail is already built. The governor's letter, Kedrick said. In my coat. Where is it? I gave it back, he said. Not shamefully. Flatly, the flat tone of a man reporting a fact about himself that he has already adjudicated. Last night, after I left you, it was part of the arrangement. Any evidence that pointed toward Harwick was to be returned immediately. He looked at her. I'm sorry. I understand what that costs you. I made a choice between my brother's life and... Stop. She held up one hand. I'm not interested in your accounting of it. I said that to Evelyn 6 weeks ago about a different betrayal. And it applies here. She looked at him and saw, with the cold clarity that had replaced everything else she'd been carrying, that he was genuinely wrecked by this. Not strategically performing remorse, but actually sitting inside the damage of having been the instrument of something he hadn't fully chosen. That was real. It didn't change what it was, but it was real. I need to know one thing, she said. Your brother. If I find him and secure him before the coronation, your actual loyalty, not the performed version. Where does it land? Kedrick met her eyes. With you, completely, without the asterisk. If you're lying, I know what you'll do. He said it simply. I know exactly what you'll do, and I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then find me Harwick's estate records, she said. Not the official ones. The properties held under subsidiary names. Every lord of his tenure has 3 or 4. It's standard practice. I know the methodology because he taught it to me. Something moved through her expression that was not humor and was not fury, but occupied the territory between them. Find me the properties. Tonight. And then I need to tell you what we're going to do, and you're not going to like it. Tell me anyway. We're going to let Harwick believe he's won, she said. We're going to let him believe the correspondence reached the wrong people, that I'm implicated, that the evidence trail holds, that I'm either running for the Eastern Estate or frozen and incapable of acting. We are going to let him believe, completely and with every available piece of evidence, that the queen he spent 22 years standing next to has finally been removed from the board. She paused. And then I'm going to walk into the coronation ceremony. You can't, not as a queen, not in armor, not with guards or authority or any of the official infrastructure that he spent 8 months mapping. She looked at him, and there was something in her face that hadn't been there before. Not in the observatory, not in the strategy chamber, not in the dark garden. Something that had been there all her life and had been kept precisely, carefully, functionally contained, and was now moving through the careful containment like water through cracked stone. I'm going to walk in as myself, just that. Without the architecture, without the performance, without the 37 years of usefulness as the thing that gives me the right to be in the room. She breathed in. And I'm going to find out what's left when all of that is gone. Kedrick was very still. Can you work with that? She said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I've been working with exactly that since I left the guard report on your desk 4 months ago, he said. I just didn't know if you could. The garden was fully gray now, the first suggestion of real light beginning at the eastern wall, the city beyond waking into its ordinary rhythms. Somewhere a horse, somewhere a vendor, somewhere the 10,000 small sounds of a kingdom going about its business without any awareness of what was being decided in a cold garden above it. One more thing, Kedrick said, Harwick's candidate. The person he's been building this around. He looked at her directly. I told you I didn't know. She waited. I lied, he said. I know. I've known for 6 days and I didn't tell you because… He stopped, seemed to be weighing something. Because when I tell you, it is going to change everything, not just the plan, not just the next 3 days. He paused. You. The light was coming up over the wall. Her blade weighed what it weighed. The city sounded like it always sounded. The indifferent, ordinary music of people who were not queens and did not have 3 days and did not have the specific frozen quality that had come over Seraphina Vale as she looked at Kedrick's face and understood, before he said a word, that whoever he was about to name was someone she loved. There was only one person left who qualified. Say it, she said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her, distantly. He said the name. And the woman who had spent 37 years building herself into something unbreakable stood in a cold garden in the early light and felt, for the first time in her adult life, every single thing she had built simply stop holding. Not collapse, not shatter, just stop. And in the silence of that stopping, something entirely new and entirely unknown began, quietly and without permission, to take its first breath. The name was Eveline. She stood in the garden and let it move through her the way cold moves through stone. Not fast, not dramatic, just the slow, complete penetration of something that changes the temperature of everything it touches. Eveline. Her sister. The gentle one. The beautiful one. The one untouched by politics and bloodshed. The one who had begged her to flee and wept with guilt in the observatory and pressed her bruised wrist against her own body and said, He's frightened, Sarah. You're the only one who ever… Performance. All of it. Not the bruise. She didn't think the bruise was performed. Alaric's fear was real, and the grab had been real. That detail had too much texture to be manufactured. But the rest, the midnight visit, the East Garden. Stay there, she's in the East Garden. The fallback point is confirmed. The letter on its way to Fenwick carried by Mara's brother, who was either complicit or simply a man whose route had been watched and would be intercepted before it cleared the city gate. She thought about the observatory, about the candle, about I never wanted this, and I told him no, and the specific authenticity of her sister's grief, which she had read and accepted and built decisions around. She was very good at reading people. Harwick had taught her how. Harwick, who had also taught Evelyn. Apparently. How long? She said. Same 2 words she'd used on Alaric. Same flat register. She was starting to understand that these were the only words that mattered when the structure fell. Not why and not how, could you, but simply the timeline, the precise duration of the thing you hadn't seen, because the duration was the only fact that told you the true scope of your own blindness. I don't know when it started, Kadrick said. I know that when Harwick approached me 8 months ago, he referenced her as an established asset, not a new one. He paused. Which means at minimum a year, possibly longer, possibly longer, possibly the bruise was real, and the grief was real, and the East Garden was genuine, and Evelyn was a person who had been turned so gradually, so carefully, so precisely through the specific pressure points that Harwick had mapped the way he had mapped everything. Her gentleness weaponized, her love for her sister converted into the most effective intelligence channel available. Because who knew Seraphina's behaviors and fallbacks and private grief better than the person she had almost allowed herself to trust completely? She breathed in, out, the blade on her forearm, the garden wall, the city. Is she being coerced? She said. I don't know. Best assessment. Kedrick was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that she was given a story about what she was doing, a version in which she was protecting you, in which Harwick's plan was, I think he told her it was a controlled transition, that removing Alaric was in your interest, that positioning someone stable and prepared was better than letting the king's weakness produce chaos. He paused. I think she believes she's been helping you. Something in Seraphina's chest moved, not softened, not warmed, but shifted, the way tectonic things shift, the slow, enormous movement of something that had been still for a very long time. Her sister believed she was helping, had been fed a narrative precise enough and compassionate enough to convert genuine love into operational usefulness. Harwick had not turned Evelyn against her. He had used Evelyn's love for her as the mechanism. That was the cruelest version. She recognized it as the version that was most likely true. The candidate, she said. He told her she was the candidate. Kedrick said nothing, which was confirmation. He told her that she would be queen, not Alaric's queen, the actual queen, that the succession would pass to her with full council endorsement and his backing, that the kingdom would be stable and fair and everything Alaric had failed to make it, and that Seraphina would be... She stopped. What did he tell her I would be? Protected, Kedrick said quietly. Honored. Given the Eastern estate not as a dismissal, but as a reward. That you would finally be free to live without the weight of it. He looked at her. He told her it was the ending you deserved. She stood with that for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Where is he? Harwick? His official residence is... He's not at his official residence. Not today. Not with 3 days to the coronation. He's at a working location. Somewhere he can manage the final coordination. She looked at the garden wall, at the pale beginning of real dawn beyond it. Find me the property records. Now. Today. We have maybe 6 hours before they realize I'm not moving toward Voss and start adjusting. And Evelyn. She looked at him. I'll handle Evelyn. She found Harwick at the 3rd property. Not personally. She sent Kedrick's men, 2 of them, dressed as grain merchants, to confirm occupation before she moved. They came back in 4 hours with the information that the Thornfield estate, held under a subsidiary name she recognized as one Harwick had used for a disputed inheritance settlement 7 years ago, had 6 additional horses in the stable and lit windows in the east wing at an hour when the estate should have been empty. She went at midday. Not at night. Night was expected. Night was when people who were hiding moved, and she was done moving in the patterns they expected. She went at midday in a plain wool dress with the blade on her forearm and Kedrick 2 steps behind her, and they came through the estate's kitchen entrance because the kitchen entrance of any property was the one location that was always staffed with people who were loyal to the building rather than to whoever happened to be occupying it that week. The cook didn't stop them. She looked at Serafina's face and stood aside without a word. The specific deference of someone who has been in service long enough to recognize the quality of authority that doesn't require announcement. She found Harwick in the East Wing study. He was alone. She had expected that, had counted on it, in fact, because a man managing a 3-day countdown to a complex operation didn't want bodies in the room, didn't want witnesses to the final adjustments, didn't want anyone close enough to see the gap between the composed exterior and whatever